Most people know how this story is supposed to end. Plucky British pilots, outnumbered but unbroken, climb into their Spitfires and Hurricanes and turn back the largest air force the world has ever seen. It's one of the cleanest victory narratives in modern history, few against many, David against Goliath, and Britain wins. What the story usually leaves out is how close that ending came to not happening at all. For roughly 2 weeks in late August and early September of 1940, Royal Air Force Fighter Command was not winning a battle of attrition. It was losing one. Its most experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Its most important airfields were being hit so hard, so repeatedly, that its own commanders privately doubted the system could hold together for another month. To understand why the RAF nearly lost, we first need to understand what winning actually required, and it wasn't shooting down the most German aircraft. It was something far more fragile and far easier to break. By the summer of 1940, Germany controlled the coastline of Western Europe from Norway to the Spanish border. An invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, depended on one precondition the German High Command considered non-negotiable: air superiority over the Channel and the invasion beaches. As long as RAF fighters could contest the skies, any German invasion fleet crossing open water was a target, not a plan. Which meant the Luftwaffe's job was not simply to bomb Britain. It was to destroy RAF Fighter Command as a functioning force. Its aircraft, yes, but more precisely its pilots, its airfields, and the command structure that got fighters into the air fast enough to matter. The German command believed this was achievable, and the belief wasn't unreasonable. In the battles over France and Norway, the RAF had already lost roughly 1,000 aircraft, over 500 of them fighters. German intelligence consistently underestimated British aircraft production and overestimated the damage their raids were doing. The campaign opened in July with the Kanalkampf. The Channel battles, attacks on British shipping convoys designed less to sink ships than to drag RAF fighters into a war of attrition close to French airfields, where German aircraft had every fuel and range advantage. The attacks against shipping accomplished little on their own, sinking only around 24,500 tons of British shipping, but they succeeded at the real goal: forcing Fighter Command into constant, exhausting patrols. Then, on the 13th of August, Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe escalated. Nearly 1,500 sorties were flown against RAF airfields, ports, and aircraft factories in a single day, the opening move of a campaign explicitly designed to grind Fighter Command's sector stations into rubble. This is where most documentaries speed past the part that actually mattered, because the RAF's survival was never primarily about individual dogfights. It depended on a system, and that system had a breaking point that the Luftwaffe came close to finding. Fighter Command's entire defense rested on something called the Dowding system, named for its architect, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Chain-home radar stations along the coast detected incoming German formations while they were still forming up over France. That information moved to filter rooms, where it was cross-checked and plotted, then passed down to sector stations, command centers, each controlling a cluster of squadrons that scrambled the right number of fighters to the right place at the right altitude. It was, for 1940, a remarkably sophisticated integration of technology and command, and it meant Fighter Command didn't need standing patrols, burning fuel, and wearing down pilots around the clock. It could react precisely, conserving its most limited resource. That resource was not aircraft, it was trained pilots. By mid-1940, the RAF had around 9,000 pilots, but only roughly 5,000 aircraft, most of them bombers, and within Fighter Command specifically, the arithmetic was brutal. With aircraft production running at roughly 300 planes a week, the pipeline was only producing about 200 new pilots in the same period. Aircraft could be replaced faster than the men who flew them. Lord Beaverbrook, put in charge of aircraft production, worked something close to a miracle keeping fighter numbers up. But no ministry could manufacture combat experience. A pilot with 6 hours of training in a Spitfire's cockpit was not equivalent to a pilot with 60, and by August, Fighter Command was increasingly sending the former into combat against German pilots who, in many cases, had already been fighting for 3 years, over Spain, over Poland, over France. This was the fracture point the Luftwaffe was aiming for, whether it fully understood it or not the planes, the men. Through the second half of August, the Luftwaffe shifted its main effort directly onto Fighter Command sector stations, Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, North Weald, Debden, the nerve centers of the entire defensive system. The 18th of August, remembered afterward as the hardest day, saw both sides suffer their heaviest losses of the battle to that point. Best estimates put RAF losses at around 27 to 34 fighters destroyed in the air, with roughly 29 more aircraft destroyed on the ground. A reminder that Fighter Command's aircraft were vulnerable even when they never left the runway. But the number that should worry a viewer more than any single day's tally is the 2-week stretch that followed. Between the 23rd of August and the 6th of September, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's No. 11 Group alone lost 295 aircraft and 103 pilots killed, with a further 128 wounded. No. 11 Group covered exactly the airspace over southeast England the Luftwaffe was pounding hardest, which meant this was happening to the squadrons standing directly between London and the German bomber fleets. Park was not a man given to alarm for its own sake. He warned explicitly that fighter defenses risked collapsing outright if the Germans kept hammering the airfields, operations rooms, and communications that made the entire system function. This wasn't a commander worried about losing a battle at the margins. This was the officer responsible for London's frontline defense telling his superiors the system itself was approaching failure. Sector stations were being hit again and again, sometimes within the same day. Runways were cratered, communications lines cut, operations rooms damaged badly enough that some squadrons had to be controlled from makeshift alternate locations. Ground crews worked through the night to patch runways that would be hit again by morning. And the pilots who survived each engagement climbed back into cockpits that afternoon, and the next day, and the day after that, with less sleep. Less experience in the replacements arriving beside them, and less margin for error every single sortie. The average age of an RAF fighter pilot in 1940 was just 20. The average age of those killed was 22. These were not seasoned veterans absorbing losses comfortably. They were young men running out of runway in every sense of the phrase. If the Luftwaffe had maintained this exact pressure, airfields and sector stations, without pause, for another 2 or 3 weeks, there's a reasonable case that Fighter Command's ability to coordinate a defense over southeast England would have genuinely broken down, not been defeated in some symbolic sense. Broken down operationally, the way any complex system fails when its most irreplaceable component runs out faster than it can be replenished. That didn't happen, and the reason it didn't happen is one of the great accidents of the entire war. On the night of the 24th into the 25th of August, a group of German bombers, off course and under pressure, dropped their bombs not on an airfield or industrial target, but on central London. It appears to have been a navigational mistake rather than a deliberate strike, but Churchill treated it as a provocation. The following night, RAF Bomber Command struck Berlin in retaliation. Hitler was reportedly furious. On the 5th of September, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its main effort away from Fighter Command's airfields and onto London and other major British cities, the campaign that would become known as the Blitz. This is the single decision that historians most often point to as the moment the tide of the Battle of Britain turned, and the reasoning is straightforward. German intelligence believed Fighter Command was on the verge of collapse, and that bombing the capital would draw the RAF's last remaining fighters into one final, decisive engagement. They were half right. Fighter Command was closer to collapse than German intelligence probably even realized. But shifting the target from sector stations to London handed Dowding and Park exactly what they needed most time. Airfields that had been cratered daily stopped being hit. Sector stations that had been struggling to function got to repair runways, restore communications, and rest exhausted pilots without the immediate threat of another raid landing on the same spot within hours. British fighter production, under Beaverbrook's direction, had continued rising and kept pace with losses, while pilot shortages were gradually eased by transfers from other branches and the arrival of Polish, Czech, and Canadian squadrons. It's worth sitting with how narrow this margin actually was. The system that stood between an invasion fleet and the English coast was not saved by a brilliant counter-strategy. It was saved because the enemy blinked at exactly the moment its pressure was working and pointed the hammer somewhere else. There's a reason the RAF's eventual victory gets remembered as inevitable, and it's the same reason most retrospective accounts of close calls end up sounding tidier than they were. We know how it ended, so the middle gets compressed. But look at what actually kept Fighter Command alive through its worst stretch, and it wasn't superior numbers. At the outset of the battle, the Luftwaffe fielded something in the region of 2,600 aircraft against roughly 640 RAF fighters, a real and significant disparity that never fully closed. What kept the system running was a combination of factors that each, individually, could easily have gone the other way. Beaverbrook's production miracle, the doubting system's early warning advantage, which let outnumbered squadrons meet raids at the time and place of fighter commands, choosing rather than the Luftwaffe's. And a genuinely international pilot roster. Roughly a fifth of the pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain were not British at all, including 145 Poles, 127 New Zealanders, 112 Canadians, and 88 Czechoslovaks, many of whom had already lost their own countries to the same air force, now attacking Britain, and flew with a ferocity born of exactly that. Doubting himself gave the Polish squadrons specific credit for the outcome, saying that without their remarkable contribution and courage, he hesitated to say the battle would have ended the same way. None of this was destiny. It was a narrow accumulation of decisions, mistakes, and reinforcements arriving just in time, and it could have collapsed at several distinct points along the way, most dangerously in that last week of August, when Keith Park's own group was bleeding aircraft and pilots faster than the pipeline could replace them. The comfortable version of this story treats the outcome as proof of British resilience triumphing over German aggression, full stop. The more honest version is less flattering to everyone involved and more useful. Fighter Command didn't win because it was simply braver or better. It won because a complex, fragile system, radar stations, filter rooms, sector airfields, a razor-thin pipeline of trained pilots, held together just long enough for an external mistake to relieve the pressure at precisely its weakest moment. Shift the German bombing campaigns, pivot to London a week later, and the calculation looks very different. Keep hammering the sector stations through the first 2 weeks of September instead, and Keith Park's warnings about outright collapse stop being a worst-case scenario and start being a timeline. That's not a story about inevitable victory. It's a story about how thin the margin actually was between the Battle of Britain becoming the RAF's finest hour and becoming the moment Fighter Command simply ran out of pilots. The Spitfires climbing into the summer sky in 1940 make for a better postcard than the exhausted 20-year-olds who flew them, the cratered runways they kept taking off from anyway, and the 2 weeks in late August when the men responsible for defending London genuinely didn't know if the system would hold. It held, barely, and that's the part of the story worth remembering.